I mean, what other way is there to be when you're at New York Comic Con, and especially if you were joined by Connor Ratliff?
Hello, thank
Hi.
you for talking to me. There's so many people here, but it can be a very lonely place also, you know? Because it's filled with strangers, so it's nice to make friends.
It is. I just wrapped a panel. I did a panel for our This Week in Marvel show, and I brought in a couple of comedian friends and Jesse Falcon, who was a longtime improviser at UCB.
Yeah.
And so we talked about improv and stuff, and I found it, just interesting because I asked Jesse, did comics and Marvel and characters influence your feelings about comedy, about the way you think about, comedy? And for him, he was like, oh my God, so much. And just like having those superhero stories really drove his sense of humor in a certain way. What about for you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, everything here in some ways I feel like is connected to things that I found, like things that I found funny as a kid, things that I found engaging, and it definitely, like doing improv at UCB, there's always like anything that you've learned from any kind of storytelling or any kind of genre stuff like that is always it's deep, it's hardwired,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I hear that you have a 12-hour, this is real, people,
Yes.
a 12-hour podcast.
Yeah, I host well, it feels weird to say host because it's too long to feel like hosting, but I have a podcast called 12 Hour Day with JD and Connor, and it's me and JD Amato, and every episode is 12 hours long, no edits. It's a full experience. I think we just did our 14th episode of it. So like each episode is longer than a full season of Game of Thrones, to give you some idea. But we've had episodes where, we ride the Staten Island ferry. We've had one episode we flew to Colorado for a wedding during the episode, and we fell asleep on the plane. And then we were going to cut that part out, and then fans of the podcast demanded that we leave 2.5 hours of ambient airplane noise in the episode.
How dare you even consider editing?
Well, in hindsight, yeah, it was. What were we thinking?
Yeah.
Of course, that's part of the podcast, but yeah, it's the kind of podcast that no one else is going to do. I think it was JD's idea, and he asked me because he knew that I was probably the only person he knew who would agree to talk that long.
I feel like this could be a Guinness World Record, for longest episode of a podcast for a series. You got to engage the Guinness people.
Yeah, Guinness, if you're out there, there should be put us in your book, put us on the website, whatever it is. But at least we certainly have the record for most episodes of a 12-hour long podcast. If there's someone else out there, they're going to have to work hard to catch up.
I hope there's another. Well, actually,
we actually, and I think this could happen. We're actually talking about turning it into a TV show.
Or would you do the full 12?
Well, yeah. In the old days, there'd be no station that would give you 12 hours except maybe a public access station or something. But in a streaming world,
right,
you can do a 12-hour episode,
yeah.
And it's honestly the same as binge watching a season. People do that. It's just like, think of it as you just get the whole season at once. Some years we've only had time to record one episode, but it doesn't feel like we're slacking because it's like, well, that's 12 episodes of a normal podcast that's an hour long. And if you look at podcasts that are like 10 minutes or 15 minutes, I mean, I can't even do the math on it. It's so many episodes.
Secret for me, we have a lot of cats at home, and so I feel very guilty all the time of leaving them.
Yeah.
So I will put on 8-hour long videos designed for cats.
Cat stimulation.
It's great.
If you want, we'll do a segment in our we'll do a whole episode for cats if you want. We'll do one that's targeted directly at cats. We know there are people who are fans of the show who they'll listen to it in segments over time, and there are other people who listen to it over and over and they go to sleep to it because they find it soothing.
That's amazing.
It's also very strange because I will meet people who are fans of the podcast, and what I'll realize is they've spent hundreds of hours just quietly hanging out with me, and I haven't been aware of that, with them just saying nothing. They know so much about me, and I know nothing about them. We had an episode where John Flansburgh from They Might Be Giants, he's a fan of the podcast, and he asked if he could be on it. And JD and I are such huge They Might Be Giants fans from when we were very young. And it was so strange because the first thing that he asked about was if I had how I was adapting to leaving my job at Barnes & Noble. And I realized John Flansburgh knows so much about me. Like, I know I've spent decades listening to his music, but he spent hundreds of hours listening to me talk about my life. And he had more questions for us than we had for him.
I love
Fascinating.
that.
Yeah, it's a dynamic that cannot be replicated unless you do a 12-hour podcast and get people to listen to it and then be on it with you.
You know, and I find it so cool. It says so much about you guys and your dynamic and building this fan base, because the trend is always like shorter, more snackable. Like, you got to get attention spans, all this other stuff. It's like, no, but there's a place for something like that.
The stuff that bite-sized stuff is fine, but if I really like something, I want a lot of it. And so, some people will know instantly that a 12-hour podcast is not for them, and that is fine. But there are people who are like, oh no, this is great. I have a job where I can't keep up with the number of hours that I need content for. Even in this content-rich environment that we currently live in, there are people who listen to the podcast who are just like, I have a job that I'm really bored at all day, and when you drop an episode, it means that like a whole shift or two is now filled up, with something interesting. We try to be interesting, but it's also, we're not trying to be entertaining the whole time. You can't. We usually forget. You know how they say when, like, on reality shows or with documentaries, that after a while people forget about the crew and they start like just behaving, and that's when you really get the footage. There is always a moment in every episode where I will realize that I have forgotten that we're recording. And I haven't yet had to do anything. A couple of times we've had to go back and bleep certain things because we've said things that we realize, like, oh, we can't talk about that. So you'll hear like certain dropped audio. A couple of times also the recorder has crashed and we've had to like there's an edit for a technical reason. The other thing is we have almost always gone over.
Wow.
Sometimes we've gone over by as much as an hour, because you don't realize when you're starting out a 12-hour podcast, the first few hours you feel like, oh, this is going to take forever. But then you get a head of steam built up, and sometimes we get to the 12th hour and we're just like, no, but I just need to finish talking about this one thing. And or one time we were like stuck in Manhattan waiting for a train to get back to Queens, where we both live in different parts of Queens. And so we were just like, we might as well just keep recording. It's going to take us an hour to get home. No reason to turn it off now. So it's just like, well, we're over again.
So when you're doing, sorry, Justin, I want to, when you're recording there, does other people sort of like watch you, just be like, do they ever come in and be like, what are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, we've had people come up and interact, and then they're part of the podcast. And if we run into people, it's one of those things where it's like, we don't typically have guests, but sometimes we'll go out and we'll just bump into people on the street that we know. And then one time we were looking, also sometimes we're looking for an outlet to charge, because we've had times where we're like on the go and we're going to lose the podcast unless we find an outlet.
Right.
And one time we went to the Upright Citizens Brigade Training Center just for an outlet, and we ended up with a late-night TV show, talk show writers roundtable, because a couple of our friends, like Sal Gentile, who writes for Late Night with Seth Meyers, and like several other people, and we realized, oh, all of these people write for late-night talk shows. So we're like, okay, this is a segment of our podcast where we talk to a bunch of late-night comedy writers, and we talked to them for, I think, 2 or 3 hours, and it was just a fragment of our podcast. But for them, it was like they'd done this marathon 3-hour podcast. And we're like, it was just something we did while we were charging the equipment.
Yeah.
You know?
I love that.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I think my first exposure to you was during what I would think if you were going to be a superhero, this would be kind of the origin story of how you are who you are, and it involved an umbrella on the third rail.
Yes, that was on the 7 train in the New York City subway system. It broke down, but I still had a signal on my phone, and we were stalled for several hours. And it was reported in the press, comedian has nervous breakdown. Really what it was is I was bored, and I was a little anxious. Nobody likes being trapped in a train, you know. But I just started tweeting everything that came into my head. And so I started getting tweets from people who are like, dude, are you okay? Like, what's going on? And then they eventually let us out of the train. It was like snowy outside and everything, and it was because someone had dropped an umbrella onto the train tracks. And so we were trapped for hours, and I turned it into something.
But it was
I turned it into
something.
content.
Hashtag content.
Hashtag content.
I love it. Where can we find you? Where, like, social media, website?
Social media, at Connor Ratliff. I'm here at Comic-Con doing a panel I do a show at UCB, at the UCB Theater every month called the George Lucas Talk Show, where I pretend to be George Lucas, and I interview real guests as themselves. We've been doing it for over 4 years now.
Wow.
And we've got a panel here tonight where we've got Sonia Manzano, who is Maria on Sesame Street, and Will Butler from Arcade Fire, and Travis McElroy from My Brother and Me, and Greg Delisle, who's a voice actress who does like Lego Star Wars. And so tonight we're gonna give away a ton of prizes, and I pretend to be George Lucas, and Griffin Newman from The Tick, he is my talk show sidekick, and because he does a great impression of Watto from The Phantom Menace. And
no money, no parts, no deal.
Yeah, no deal. He does a great Dorian impression, and Toydarian impression. And so, yeah, we'll be doing that tonight and every month at UCB Theater.